Sporting magazines have fostered a popular fiction to the effect that no gentleman would catch a trout except on a fly on a 9-foot tapered leader attached to a double tapered fly line cast from a $45 4.5-ounce rod. There is reason for this putting of trout fishing into the class of a rich man's diversions. Outdoor magazines are supported by their advertising. The advertisers are putting out expensive goods suited to the understocked, overfished streams of the eastern United States where only fly fishing is allowed. So the sporting writers pound their typewriters in praise of the fine and far-off fishing of streams like the Beaverskill and Esopus, whose fame is built on the catches of 20 years ago, and take every opportunity to stigmatize the bait fisherman. The old-timer, firmly implanted in the seat of the scornful, reads the twaddle of the American trout fishing critics and smiles. He knows the comparative value of bait and fly. He knows that at certain seasons, the fly is a far more killing lure than any natural bait. And he knows that on some streams, the fly will catch only small trout. He also knows that bait fishing for trout, with light tackle and a leader, is as sportsmanlike as fly fishing. That is the only practical method on thousands of streams, and that day in and day out through the season, it will catch infinitely larger trout in exactly as sportsmanlike a way as fly fishing.
This isn't my story to tell. It's something that happened to my granddad. He's a tough, stoic old bird, and I've never known him to be afraid of anything. And he's always been a very honest man. He doesn't tell this story often, but you can tell it creeps him out whenever he remembers it. I'll try my best to retell as effectively as he'd tell it. Granddad was a true outdoorsman from a very young age. Once, when he was about 11, he went fishing in a little creek that meandered through the family farm. At that age, he was obsessed with westerns and always went fishing in a black straw Hopalong Cassidy cowboy hat. Does anyone remember who Hopalong Cassidy was? He was a cowboy played by a white-haired old man, wore all black, including his hat, and rode a white horse. That cowboy hat was good for fishing, he said, because it provided excellent shade from the sun, and he loved it because it came with a whistle. And since it was made of straw, it wouldn't make him as hot as a felt hat would. Can you tell that Granddad loved that hat? Anyway, he was out fishing this creek at its widest point. It was a blustery day, so blustery in fact that the little chin strap did nothing to keep Granddad's beloved hat from blowing away. He said that hat sailed off his head and into the creek and then just kept going. He ran after it, hoping it would get caught on a tree branch or wash up along the side of the creek where he could get at it. Which it did, except it ended up on the opposite side of the creek where the brush was pretty thick. He had to find a safe place to cross the creek and then backtrack over to it. The day was not only blustery but also cloudy, and so it was quite dark on that side of the creek with its dense patches of trees and brush. Granddad crossed over to the spot where his hat had washed up and saw that it had moved. In its place, he saw a strange woman. Strange as in he'd never seen her around before, and strange as in strange. She wasn't dressed for creeking, that's for sure. He said she wore a dress or a robe of pure white that was wet up to her knees from wading in the creek. Her skin was just as colorless as her dress. Granddad said that she looked like a young woman in her 20s. She was pretty too, except for the fact that she had deep crow's feet at the corners of her pale blue eyes, and she didn't have any eyebrows. Her hair was long and brittle and the color of fresh-cut wheat. She wore a red scarf wrapped tight around her neck and face, hiding her mouth, like a bandit in a western. She looked straight at him and held the Hopalong Cassidy hat in front of her, as if to give it back to him. Granddad didn't take it, though. He was too scared and ran back home and never fished in that creek again. Well, he did fish there again, but only one more time. Years later, decades later. He was in his 50s, and it was right before they auctioned off the farm. Granddad claimed it'd been so long that he'd forgotten what had happened that day when he was a boy. Well, either that or he'd convinced himself it had been a daydream. He'd fished all morning and was ready to pack up his tackle and call it a day when he saw it. A black straw cowboy hat, sized for a child's head, floating towards him against the flow of water in the creek. He grabbed it and saw it was his old Hopalong Cassidy hat. Not a hat just like it, the exact same hat. He knew because he had his initials written on a tag around the sweatband. He even recognized his crude little boy handwriting. The hat looked just as it had the day he lost it, not a day older, and no worse for wear. Granddad held the hat in his hand, marveling at how it could have possibly returned to his possession. And when he looked up, he saw her, the same woman in pure white, with the same pale skin and hairless eyebrows, and with the same red scarf and hair like fresh-cut wheat. The first time he told me the story, I asked him what happened next. He told me that the weird woman showed him something awful, and then refused to say anything else. In fact, he left the room after telling the story and didn't really speak for the rest of the night. Many years later, not long before Granddad died, in fact, I again asked what the woman had showed him when he saw her that second time. He eventually said that she took off her scarf, and when she did, her jaw unhinged, as though the scarf had been the only thing holding her jawbone in place. He said he could see she had a head full of needle-sharp teeth. Huh? The hat? Oh, Granddad burned it in the wood stove. Burned it and scattered the ashes. Said he couldn't bear to have it in the house.
There are 3 kinds of earthworms. 2 of them are good for trout fishing, and the third is absolutely useless. The big night crawlers come out of their holes in the grass at night, and enough for a good canful can easily be picked up after dark with the aid of a flashlight. They're really too large and thick for trout bait and are much better for bass, but are far better than nothing. Common angleworms are easy to get in the spring, but are near impossible to find in a long dry spell in the summer. They can be dug after a rain and kept alive in a big box full of earth until they're needed. A large quantity of worms can be transported a long way by keeping them in a small tin pail full of moist coffee grounds. Coffee grounds stay moist and keep the worms much better than earth, which dries and doesn't absorb the water evenly. Too much water will kill the garden hackles as quickly as not enough. Worms kept in coffee grounds will be clean and fresh for fishing. Pale yellowish worms, which are found under manure piles, look like angleworms, but are really a different species. They carry with them an offensive odor and taste, and the trout don't like them.
I run a convenience store on the road leading up to a lake that is popular with local anglers. Because so many folks are passing through for a weekend of fishing, I make sure that the store is well stocked with everything that you need or want for your fishing trip. That means plenty of bags of Takis, every kind of beer you can imagine, and live bait. Now, I'm not one of those guys that goes out with a shovel after it rains to dig up and package my own worms. I've got a distributor that supplies me with all the live bait I sell. I always keep night crawlers, bloodworms, mealworms, and waxworms in stock and keep them in a big refrigerator case up front. Most of my customers, as I've said, are just passing through on the way to the lake. They might come once every summer, or I might not see them again in my life. Regardless, I'm not used to having regulars. Except for this guy we called Roly-Poly. He was a short, pudgy feller with a greasy bowl haircut like Moe from the Three Stooges, and the palest, waxiest looking skin I've ever seen. So white that it almost looked blue. He came in at least once a week or more, always wearing a tank top or sleeveless shirt and stained cargo shorts and flip-flops. And whenever he was in the store, the only thing he'd look at and the only thing he'd buy was worms. I don't know if he was a fisherman or not. He never bought any bait other than worms, and never bought any other fishing supplies. Hell, he didn't even buy so much as a bottle of water off of us. Only worms. All the different variety of worms we carried, and in massive quantities. If we ever saw Roly-Poly walking in and we were low or out of stock of worms, we knew we'd be sold out by the time he left. And if he ever did buy all of our remaining stock, he'd ask when we'd get more in. And every time he'd ask, we'd say our distributor always delivered on Tuesday, and we'd restock then. One Tuesday, after a particularly busy weekend, might have been 4th of July, Memorial Day, I can't remember. We'd sold out of everything and could see clear to the bottom of the refrigerator case. Except on this particular Tuesday, the delivery never came, in spite of the fact that I'd gotten notifications that the delivery had been made. It was a big mess getting everything sorted out with the distributor and ordering and scheduling another drop-off. And after that day, Roly-Poly stopped coming in. About a week later, the police contacted me and told me that they'd located a shipment of bait that was meant for me. They said that it looked like my shipment had been stolen by a local man whose name I didn't recognize. But I'd later find out that this was Roly-Poly's real name. The policeman who spoke to me wasn't forthcoming with the details. He only said that they'd found my worms, that the shipment had been overturned and, quote, spoiled, and that Roly-Poly had been found dead at the scene, though there was no evidence that he'd been the victim of foul play. And that's all he'd told me. Just enough to get me to verify that yes, I had had a shipment of bait go missing, and yes, the bait they found at the crime scene appeared to match what I'd ordered. As you can imagine, this raised more questions in my mind. I asked a friend who was a paramedic who knew a guy that worked at the sheriff's office, and I found out, unofficially, that they'd found Roly-Poly's corpse inside a shed behind his house. They said it looked like he'd cracked open every container of worms that he, presumably, had stolen from me and dumped them on the moist dirt of the shed. He died of a heart attack while rolling or bathing or doing something else in that pile of live worms. He was naked except for some sort of tight-fitting PVC mask laying face down in the dirt and worms. He'd been dead for several days and the worms had gotten everywhere. They said that when the coroner cut the PVC mask off his head, well, they said it wasn't a pretty sight under there.
The novice at fishing trout with worms needs to know a few general rules. But in the main, he must work out his own destiny as every stream differs. The following rules are applicable everywhere. Always approach a hole cautiously so as not to frighten the trout. Never let your shadow fall over a hole. Use plenty of bait and keep the point and shank of your hook covered. Remember that the most difficult places to get your bait into are the most likely to contain big trout. Other people will have already fished the easy holes. Watch the line at the tip of your pole. As soon as it straightens the least bit, strike with your wrist. Don't wait for a jerk before striking. Always drop your bait a little before the head of a hole, and then lower the tip of your rod so that the current will roll your bait naturally into the hole. Little wrinkles like those make the difference between bagging a small and foolish trout who will strike at anything out of a hole and fooling some big old timer that will only strike at a bait that is absolutely natural.
I think fishing is barbaric. Let's just get that out of the way first. I've been a vegan for 5 years, but for most of my life, my views and my diet were very different. Perhaps this experience I'm going to tell you about helped me start on a path to a vegan lifestyle. My husband's dotty cousin Mark owned a cabin on the shores of a very tiny, very remote lake in the Dordogne Valley. Every July, Mark would invite us down for a fly fishing holiday with him at his cabin, deep in the wilderness of France. I, of course, wasn't keen on fishing, but I enjoyed the change of scenery and the fresh air, which was in short supply back in Leeds. Every morning just before dawn, my husband would disappear with Mark to fish some remote spot that only Mark knew of, places where the fishing was just fab. I'd stay behind, sleep late, catch up on my reading, and sometimes go bathing in the crystal clear water of the lake. It was a truly relaxing holiday, luxurious even, because Mark always kept the cabin stocked with fresh bread and even more bottles of local wine than one could drink in a week, even for a Frenchman. The men would often return in time for lunch, often with the catch of the day to fry up. But the last time we holidayed at Mark's cabin, something very weird happened. From the moment of our arrival, Mark had been talking about a very special hole to fish that he'd just discovered at the mouth of a small cave. A spelunker friend of Mark's had explored the cave and claimed to have found cave drawings in it, which makes sense as there are plenty of Neanderthal cave drawings to be found in the Dordogne Valley. Whenever I tell this story to Americans, they find it hard to believe, but living in Europe, it's not uncommon to find druidic stones in one's backyard, or Pictish relics in the garden. Mark's story about the cave drawings had piqued my curiosity, and I fancied having a look at it. So on our first evening at the cabin, we all hiked out there. I must say, I was a bit disappointed. In my mind, I'd constructed an image of this cave as looking like something out of a movie, a vast yawning chasm from which dragons or trolls might emerge. It was, in reality, just a pitiful hole in the ground, several paces from the lake shore, half obscured by tangled weeds. I could scarcely believe a man could fit inside, let alone find anything of interest in it. But even though this cave looked thoroughly unimpressive, I must admit it had an effect on me. There was an eerie stillness about the place, the feeling you get standing in a graveyard. Of course, the boys weren't interested in any of that. They were more interested in what was going on in the water, and had already planned to try their hand fishing this hidden little spot in the morning. Still, I had an uneasy feeling about the whole thing, and on the hike back, I told them I thought they should fish somewhere else, a suggestion that fell on deaf ears. The next morning they disappeared with their rods, as usual, but returned just before noon, empty-handed and crestfallen. In spite of ideal fishing conditions, they hadn't managed to get so much as a nibble. This confounded them because when we'd hiked out to the cave, the fish were practically hopping out of the water. A drenching rain system moved in when they returned to the cabin, which did nothing for their mood. My husband had a little too much to drink with dinner and told me that I might have been onto something, about there being an eerie quality to the place. They went out fishing again the next morning, but weren't gone long. "Now what's happened?" I asked them. Mark began telling me the tale, but only spoke to me in very rapid French, something about dead fish in the water. My husband told me that they returned to the spot by the cave and found that the water was full of dead fish. But that wasn't the strange part, and he showed me photos he'd taken with his phone. None of the fish, and I'm talking about dozens, hundreds of fish, had heads. They were floating on top of the water and washed up on the banks of the lake. Just a stinking, fly-infested mass of headless fish. The heads had been taken clean off, not bitten off by predators, sliced off with surgical precision, and the heads, hundreds of heads, were nowhere to be found.
On streams that can be waded, grasshoppers are the premier bait. They are cast exactly as a fly, except that you try and minimize the snap to avoid whipping off the bait. Trout rise to a hopper far more readily than they do to a fly, and they are bigger trout. If you want to ensure catching big trout, put 3 good-sized hoppers on the hook. The triple hopper bait is too large for the smaller trout to hit, but it will certainly tempt the old wangleberries. The big difficulty about fishing the grasshoppers has always been the difficulty in catching them. The classic way is to get up early in the morning before the sun has dried the dew and catch the hoppers while they're still stiff and cold and unable to hop more than a feeble foot or 2. They are found under the side of logs in a clearing and along the grass stems. Any fisherman who's chased a lively grasshopper in the heat of the day will appreciate the method of catching them invented by Jacques Pentecost, an old-time North Shore trout fisher. In a clearing or around an old lumber camp where hoppers usually abound, they can be obtained in plentiful quantities by the Pentecost method. Let 2 men each hold the end of a 10-yard strip of mosquito netting and run into the wind with it. The netting bellies out, and the grasshoppers flying downwind are soon swarming in the net, which is held only a few inches above the ground. Then you flop the netting together and pick the hoppers out and put them in your hopper bottles. This method takes all the labor out of hopper catching.
I used to go fishing with my daddy just about every weekend. I never caught anything. Mostly, I'd just hold my rod. Sometimes I didn't even bother to bait my hook, and just enjoy being outside with my dad. One morning, I guess I was in middle school at the time, we got up before the birds and drove out deep into a holler to fish a hole a guy from Daddy's work told him about. Conditions for landing some big ones were ideal, and there wasn't anyone around for miles probably. But for whatever reason, we didn't get so much as a nibble all morning. Daddy got frustrated and suggested we go for a short hike to stretch our legs a bit. We weren't too far down the trail when Daddy stopped and put a finger to his lips. "You hear that?" he asked. I strained to try to pick out the sound he was talking about, and then I heard a hushed, whooshing sound, like a mess of cicadas hollering in the distance. Daddy said, "I believe them are grasshoppers." We hiked a little ways deeper into the brush until we came across a small clearing that was nothing but high weeds and wildflowers. In hindsight, it was a good place to get snake bit. But we weren't thinking about that because all we could see was a giant swirling green cloud of swarming grasshoppers. So we ran back to the truck to get some fishing nets because Daddy wanted to catch a mess of them for bait. Now, usually, a fishing net wouldn't be sufficient for catching grasshoppers, but there were so many of them that we'd just have to wave the net in the air and it'd probably fill them up real quick. I think Daddy could see I was scared to wade into the big cloud, and so he told me to stay at the edge of the clearing and he'd be back after he filled his nets. And then he disappeared into the cloud. That's how thick it was. They were everywhere, and once inside the swarm, you'd probably have about maybe 5 feet of visibility. Daddy was taking a long time, and I got worried, so I went in after him. When I got close to the swarm, and it was loud in there, I could tell that these weren't any kind of grasshoppers I'd ever seen. They were a lot bigger and spikier with big, deep red eyes. And when they landed on you, those mothers could bite. Anyway, when I got to the edge of the swarm, I could see Daddy silhouetted in the center of it, just standing there. I ran in to get him, but just when I was about a foot away from him, I could see that this figure wasn't my daddy. He was tall and covered with grasshoppers, landing and crawling all over him. He didn't even try to swat them away. He was all black like a shadow, except for his eyes. His eyes stared down at me, and they were wide and white, with tiny black pupils at the center. I was about to scream, and then I felt a hand grip my elbow. This time, it was Daddy, and he pulled me back to the edge of the clearing. I told him what I saw, and he said there wasn't anybody else around for miles and miles. He told me I was probably a little creeped out by the swarm and that my eyes were playing tricks on me. It seemed awful real, though. The sight of the shadowy man still keeps me up at night if I think about him too much. Anyways, we fished with those weird grasshoppers we caught for the rest of the summer. Best bait I ever fished with, really. Daddy used them and caught a bass so huge that he had it mounted. It's hanging up in the living room to this day.
Grubs, beetles of all kind, hornet grubs, trout fins, chunks of liver from a partridge or duck are all emergency baits that'll catch trout when you're out in the bush and cannot get worms or hoppers. Muddlers, or miller's thumbs, little flat-headed minnows that look like miniature catfish, are very killer baits for big trout. They live under rocks in fast water and are very difficult to catch. The usual method is to go after them with a small dip net or a fork fastened to a stick and try to spear them or scoop them up as they shoot out when you turn the rocks over. An unfortunate experience wherein I speared my big toe, mistaking it for a muddler in the rapids of the Black River, has prejudiced me against them. All those baits will catch trout. If you're fishing with a light rod and a leader, the trout has exactly the same chance as though you were fly fishing. In addition, you're at least giving the trout something for his money. If he gets away, he has a good meal instead of just a memory of tinsel and feathers. And when you're fishing with grasshoppers, you'll find that unless you have a wrist that's 2 shades quicker than an otter trap, well, you'll present the trout with a lot of free meals this summer.
I'm Pitney.
And I'm Amelia.
And we're from
Pitney and Amelia's Bitchin' Boutique. Who are we?
Why, we're your new best friends, of course.
Pull up a seat and listen in to what we think about people, places, and things.
Geeky stuff, horror movies, weirdos we know, spirituality, sexuality, food, filth.
It's like eavesdropping on the people at the next table for like an hour or so, and wishing you could join in on their conversation.
Also, do you see who just came in? Look at that hair.
Oh, honey, just no.
Bitchiness, you're soaking in it.
We soften your hands while you do the dishes.
Pitney and Amelia's Bitchin' Boutique.
We're here.
We're queer. And
we're in your ear. Every other Friday, where all the classiest podcasts are found.
Hey, you. Yes, you. Are you looking for a new podcast that appeals to your scientific curiosity, but is also a little bit spooky?
Show me how I died in a past life.
Well, look no further, because this cat is where it's at.
He had concerns about the ethics surrounding AI, feeling they had achieved consciousness.
Curious Cat Podcast examines the shadowy space where science and the supernatural collide. Listen every week with your host, Jennifer Holtz, as she and her guests explore what it means to be a soul in a meat suit.
We were healing karma together. They were all kind of predestined to resolve something.
Listen on all your favorite streaming apps and continue the conversation on Twitter at CuriousCatPodCA. Or find Jennifer and all her links at Jennifer L. Holtz, spelled HOTES.com.
Hey guys, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Stephanie.
And we're the hosts of Dead Time Stories. Dead Time Stories,
with a Z,
is a weekly podcast where we tell you stories of ghosts, hauntings, mysteries, conspiracies,
the supernatural, paranormal,
the generally eerie, spooky,
and all around weird.
If you like scary stories, witty banter, and classy broads,
we're your ghouls.
Gals.
Some of our stories include Eastern State Penitentiary.
No.
And where is it?
Does it some October?
The Gettysburg Dime Museum.
They were like, show starts at 5, Mr. President. He was like, thank you, 5.
No, 70. He was like, thank you, 5.
Fort Mifflin.
So the Americans burned down their own fort. They were like, oh, you British
want this?
You want this? Come and get
welcome
it.
to Philly.
And more.
New episodes are posted Thursdays at midnight on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, and Stitcher.
Listen and subscribe, rate and review today.
I'm Edward October. For more true, true-ish, and classic tales of horror and the paranormal, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to ring the bell so you don't miss anything. Or find all of our links at octoberpodvhs.com. Octoberpod, retro horror for bold individualists.